My name is Krystel McKinnon. I am the middle child. I have an older sister and a younger sister, and I have an older brother that was adopted. I am Nishka in Wet'suwet'en, and I live here in Prince George.
Great. And so what kind of work do you do, and why are you doing that kind of work?
I'm an Aboriginal education worker. I do restorative practice in School District 57. My job consists of helping students communicate their problems that they're having, whether it be with staff or other peers or families, and it moves them away from being disciplined through punitive punishment and helping them work out their problems through identifying their emotions, how they've been affected in a situation, as well as how they affected other people, and acknowledging it, taking responsibility for their own actions.
How do you think residential school is connected to these children you're working with?
I think residential school has a huge impact on our First Nations students in the schools that I work with. Many students lack attendance. A lot of parents don't feel the need to encourage their children to be going to school, and that is a reflection of going to residential school. They see school as a negative part in their child's learning. They don't see it as an important aspect and don't make it a priority, as well as the way children deal with problems. They don't have the proper knowledge and vocabulary to express their feelings, and they leave it to anger and violence. And as a result, we have a lot of students who are removed from schools because they have a hard time being acceptably sociable in their own school settings.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's great. And when we were talking the other day, I was really moved by the story of how you've been impacted by your own father's residential school experience. But in particular, can you talk about the communication around that? I thought that was very powerful.
When I grew up, I never understood what residential school was. I'd heard the word residential school mostly come from my mother's words. I always knew my mother went to residential school. What it meant that she went there, I didn't understand. I never really heard my father talk about school as I grew up. My father had used the tools that he had learned to bring his children up. And as I got older, my father and I continued to have problems in our relationship with communicating and getting along. And when I got older and started going to post-secondary school, I then learned what residential school really was and how it impacted people. I always told people that my mother went to residential school because my father said he went to Catholic school. And one day when I was explaining to an elder some issues that my father and I were having, he had said to me, just keep in mind that our people went to residential school and the effects of what they had gone through is what we're experiencing today. And I had said, my father didn't go to residential school. And he said, yes, he did. And I said, he went to Catholic school. And he said, what do you think residential school was? And it was then that I realized he was in denial of being in residential school, and everything else made so much sense after he had said those words to me on why my father spoke the way he did and why everything was so black and white to him. I can remember when I was little and we lived in what was considered the nicer part of Prince George, and him always throwing out the whole saying, we're the only Indians on the block. And I never understood why he would say that, and I didn't see why that was important. And now I do see why he thought that was important.
Why do you think it was important to him? What did that mean to him?
I think to him it meant that anything bad that happened was because we were First Nations. It wasn't because that's just the way the cards were played, that everything fell back on we were First Nations.
Um, is there anything else you'd like to add around that? Just trying to think of that.
Yeah. So when I was supposed to finish high school, I was one class short, and my father and I weren't getting along, and I was kicked out of the house at 17. I ended up in a relationship with a man that was a few years older than me, and I mistaken what he was showing me for love as love. The jealousy, the control, the manipulation. And for years I thought that was his way of showing me love, and that was okay. And it was when I started going to college and learning about residential school and learning that this man who I had a child with had the same characteristics of my father. And I was looking for those because that's how my father showed love. I thought that was the right way. And that's how I ended up in that relationship.
So what was the end result of that?
He started doing drugs, and it wasn't a cycle like a break. He had drug use that went on further in his family, and that was a cycle that he got stuck in. And we had a son that was born who was born with severe cerebral palsy, and my attention moved away from him to my son, and I ended up having to leave that relationship.
And he was, his parents were residential school survivors then also?
His parents also went to residential school as well.
Yeah.
And they experienced violence and abuse in their past, and that carried on to their children. So when times got tough for us, my son's dad resulted to drug use.
Are families experiencing violence in more than one generation? Well, you just talked a little bit about that. Would you say your experience is really widespread for families of survivors?
Widespread as in?
You think that, do you see this in other people, the same type of experiences as you've had, say, with your own parents and with your spouse and his parents? I mean, is this a really widespread problem because of residential school?
It is a widespread problem. In this community that I see, many Aboriginal people are ashamed of being First Nations, and they don't know their culture, they don't care to understand it, and being ashamed of it, they try to be somebody else their whole life, feeling shame and guilt of who they are, and leading them into what they see as families of gangs and drug abuse.
And would you say that that the violence that comes out of that, is that a concern for you in your community? Would you say that there's a lot of impact from that? Or is that a concern for you in the community where you live?
It is a concern here. Prince George has a lot of First Nations people in this community. It covers quite a bit of our population, and as a result, it leads to a big population leading to violence to solve their problems. They always feel that they're isolated and that they need to be powerful, and their way of showing power is through violence.
Mm-hmm. So how would you connect that to residential school? What's happening for the youth that you're working with right now? How did, say, their grandparents going to residential school, how did that cause that?
Their grandparents going to residential school caused a negative impact on them, on the school system. And they don't encourage their children to go to school. They don't encourage them to do their homework, to succeed. They don't encourage them to have goals. And they label themselves as First Nations, that we're Aboriginals. We're not going to get there because we just don't get what everybody else gets. And that's put into their brains that they don't have a reason to be in the community as contributing members to our society. And that impacts their ideas on what school is, and it affects their behaviors on respecting their teachers and their students and everybody else in their community.